Okay, great. So it's great to be here. Thanks for organizing the beautiful conference to the organizers. So what I'm going to be speaking about today is causal aspects of quantum information in the context of quantum gravity. And this is based primarily on some joint work from last year with my really great collaborators, Sorce and Beni Yoshida. But because the context here, I think, is unfamiliar to a lot of this audience, in particular the quantum gravity part, I've expanded the scope out a little bit to address some of the background and hopefully give as pedagogical of a talk as possible. Okay, so I think already in this conference, we've seen a few hints of connections between quantum info and quantum gravity. And I think that the connections between these two fields take a few different forms. So one of the forms that can take is that in a number of instances, quantum gravity has inspired interesting questions in quantum information theory. So a great example of that historically is John Wheeler's group at the University of Texas and his sort of mantra of it from bit. Many information theorists got their start in his group. Another form that these connections can take is in the application of quantum information theory techniques to problems in quantum gravity. So a lot of work throughout the years, and especially recently on the black hole information problem, relies, for instance, very heavily on QI techniques. This talk is about something of a somewhat different connection, I think, in that here we're going to be looking for a framework and developing a setting where we can understand what ideas about in quantum gravity, if we take them seriously at face value, actually imply about quantum information theory. Okay. So to develop that, I'm going to have to give you a little bit of context, both in the quantum info side and on the quantum gravity side. So I'm going to do that first. On the quantum info side, we're going to be thinking about information processing tasks that happen in the context of space-time. So these are going to take the form of sort of distributed quantum computations where the inputs and outputs occur at specified locations in space and time. To describe something like that, I'm going to use a picture like this one. This is a space-time diagram, so time is running upwards here and position is running left to right. And then I have specified with these little dots locations in space-time where some input quantum systems are given to you, and then other sets of locations where quantum systems need to be returned, and then there's some overall transformation that's supposed to relate the inputs and the outputs here. Okay. When we start thinking in the space-time context, the first thing that sort of changes or that we need to start worrying about is that the causal relationships among these input and output points is relevant now. So in particular, I've drawn two of these information processing tasks, which each have the same transformation between the inputs and outputs that's required. But they're somehow very different because the placement of these input and output points is different. Okay, so in particular, on the left, the output location is in the future of the input location, so you can send your system from one point to the other, while on the right, this output location is outside the future of the input, and so this task is somehow much harder to complete than this one. Okay. Good. So in addition to the causal relationships among pairs of points, there's also relationships among sets of points that will also be important and that we're going to want to keep track of. So as an example of that, we have a situation here with two input points and two output points. And these have the property that sort of between them, there is this diamond region, which is in the future of this point and the future of this point, and then in the past of both the output points. Okay. So the existence of that region has a sort of operational implication, which is that it's possible to bring systems together from the two input points, have them interact in some way in the middle, and then send the outputs out again. Okay. To summarize those kind of relationships without always drawing these space-time diagrams, I'm going to instead just draw a directed graph. The directed graph I'm going to refer to as a causal network. And it's going to have a vertex for each input point, a vertex for each output point, an additional vertex for these causally defined regions like this diamond here, and then directed edges indicating the causal connections among these objects. Okay, good. So that's the quantum info context. Now I want to say a little bit about quantum gravity. So the structure that we're going to be making use of is what's called the AdS CFT correspondence. Okay, what is that? Well, it's a conjectured equivalence of two apparently very different looking physical theories. So on one side of the equivalence, we have a theory of quantum gravity that lives in a special kind of a space-time called an asymptotically AdS space. Okay, that's the cylinder picture that I'm drawing. On the other side of the equivalence, we have a special kind of field theory called a conformal field theory that lives in the boundary of that AdS space. Okay, so the boundary of this AdS would be some kind of a tube. I've sliced open the tube and laid it flat on the page, and that's the rectangle that I'm drawing on the right. Okay, so it has its left and right sides identified. These two theories, I claim, or the correspondence claims, are equivalent. And the high energy theorists have a particular sense in which they mean that they're equivalent. But here I just want to highlight one implication of their equivalence, which we can state and understand in the language of quantum information theory. So the way we're going to interpret this is we're going to think about information processing tasks that happen in these two pictures. And then the way we're going to understand the equivalence of these two theories is we're going to find that information processing on each side of the duality, on each side of the equivalence, is sort of equally hard. So we can do information processing equally well in the two pictures. Okay, so let's understand that in a little bit more detail. So let's start with the bulk perspective, which is this quantum gravity cylinder picture. And we're going to define there, or choose, some information processing task. Okay, we're going to think about one of these space-time information processing tasks that I introduced before. And we're in particular going to think about an information processing task that has its inputs come in from and its outputs go out to sort of infinitely far away. So you could kind of think of this like a scattering process like we would think about in field theory. Okay, in the cylinder picture, what that looks like is we have the input and output locations off at the edge of the cylinder. Okay. Now what we want to do, once we've defined a task in the bulk, is to find a corresponding sort of dual task in the boundary theory. Okay. The way that we're going to do that is pretty simple. So points at infinity from the bulk perspective is actually exactly what we mean by a point in the boundary manifold. So we can just identify input and output points across the duality in a sort of obvious way. And then I also need to specify for you to define a task what transformation you're supposed to do. And because we're just reasoning at the level of quantum information, even though the underlying degrees of freedom in the two theories are very different, it makes sense to talk about doing the same transformation in this picture or in this picture. Okay. Good. So now we have a sense of we have these two corresponding tasks across the duality. And then the implication of these two theories being equivalent is that the success probabilities for implementing each of these tasks is going to be the same in the two pictures. Okay. That's a very operational and quantum information theorist way of understanding this duality, but in this context, when I say these theories are equivalent, this is what we're going to mean. Okay. Now, that kind of a statement, I think, is interesting, one, from the perspective of AdS CFT, and indeed you can find new insights into how this duality works by starting with that statement. But additionally, if we're thinking as information theorists here, I think this is also interesting in that what it's really giving us is two perspectives on how we can complete the same information processing task, right? And in particular, the two theories live in very different geometries, and they exploit very different resources. They have available very different resources. And so what this duality is saying is, those two sets of resources and those two geometries have to be equally good for doing information processing. Okay. And that's exactly the kind of statement that we're interested in as information theorists, right? We're constantly interested in how different resources trade off or can be interchanged to implement information processing tasks. Okay. So that's kind of one of the main points I want to make in this talk, that this notion of duality in physics has a sort of a natural meaning in the context of information processing. Okay. So that's the high-level philosophy or perspective that I want to take here. But now I want to make that a bit more concrete by looking at some specific examples. Okay. So as our first example, let's think about this cylinder picture. We're going to start in the bulk we're going to define one of these information processing tasks. We'll take a simple case where there's just 2 input points and 2 output points. And then the first step in our sort of procedure we have in mind is to identify the dual corresponding task in the boundary theory. Okay, so that's going to look something like this. Then what I want to do is capture the sort of essential or operationally relevant aspects of the bulk and boundary geometries. And I'm going to do that by working out what the causal network is that describes the bulk geometry. Okay, in the particular case that I've drawn, the network is one like this, where we have sort of this vertex in the middle where the input systems can meet up. Okay. We can then also try and understand what the causal network is for the boundary geometry. This turns out to be a little bit more subtle, and there's some discussion of it in the literature, so I'll refer you to these papers. But at the end of the day, the punchline is that the right network to think about there is one like this, which only has sort of direct links between the inputs and outputs and doesn't have an interaction vertex in the middle. Okay. Now, this is a little bit puzzling, right? Because this network that we have in the boundary is somehow weaker than the one we have in the bulk, right? The bulk one lets us communicate from inputs to outputs, but it also lets us do something extra, right? And then the statement of the AdS CFT correspondence is telling us that these two networks need to be able to do the same information processing tasks. Okay, so this is a little bit strange. The resolution, though, turns out to be that the boundary theory, the CFT, has somehow some additional resource that it uses to make up for this discrepancy. And in particular, inherent in the CFT, you will always have entanglement shared between the left and the right whenever you have this vertex in the bulk. Okay, so really what the correspondence is saying is that this network on the right, equipped with some appropriate entanglement, can always simulate this one on the left. Okay. That is an interesting statement, and in particular, one thing that's interesting about it is that that exact pair of networks has been considered earlier in another context, which is in the context of quantum cryptography. There, people were interested in a task called position verification, which I won't explain in detail, but the thing to know about it is that in that context, a honest player in this cryptographic scenario has available to them a network like this one for completing some kind of challenge that they're given. Okay. A dishonest player in that scenario instead only has this weaker network and may share entanglement such that they have this available to them. Okay. So then a sort of rephrasing of this output from the correspondence is that this position verification scenario is always insecure against an attacker who has entanglement, in particular because the dishonest person who uses this can always simulate the actions of the honest person. Okay. So that statement, sort of fortunately or unfortunately, was already proven by Harry Berman, who's here, and a number of collaborators back in 2014. So we haven't learned something new, but I think it's very interesting that out of these high-energy ideas, we can get some consequence for information processing, which is, first of all, correct, right? This proof verifies this implication. And second of all, quite non-trivial, right? There was some discussion in the literature and some back and forth before this was settled in this direction, and also relevant for practical cryptographic scenarios. Okay, so I think this motivates thinking further about what AdS CFT tells us and seeing if we can push it in some new directions. Okay, so one way that you can push this is you can think about this same scenario in a little bit more detail, and what you find if you study the AdS CFT setting more carefully is that you get a sort of more quantitative version of this, which is that you learn that all of those computations, which you can perform inside of some subregion of some size of your gravitating AdS space, have to be reproducible in this non-local form using an entangled state whose mutual information is equal to the area of the bulk region. Okay, so you get some kind of precise statement here, and this statement is a little bit puzzling. Partly it's puzzling because we don't understand either of these sets particularly well, but I think it represents an opportunity to understand these things better, and there's quite a bit of work going on right now to try and constrain either one of these things to learn something about the other. Okay, that's not the direction I want to talk about further in this talk. Instead, I want to push this in another way, which is we can say, okay, well, we had this AdS scenario where we picked 2 input points and 2 output points, and we learned some equivalence among networks like this. What if we just pick more input and output points and find some more complicated networks in the bulk and the boundary? What do we now learn about information processing in those networks from this correspondence? Okay. So the general form of the statement that we're going to find is that we will pick these points, we'll study the bulk geometry, we'll learn what network we have there, let's call it gamma. We'll study the boundary geometry, we'll find some network there, gamma hat. And then the CFT is going to have some pattern of entanglement, which we don't know what it is yet. And then the claim we're going to find is that these things have to be able to simulate each other. Okay, those are equivalent. The main technical obstacle to being able to use this in a precise way is that we need to pin down what entanglement you have in the CFT given a specification of bulk and boundary network. Okay. So the main contribution of this work that I started out by mentioning with John and Beni is to prove a theorem, just sort of within AdS CFT and actually using tools from general relativity that constrains the entanglement in the CFT given a specification of bulk and boundary network. Okay, it doesn't do this in all cases, but it does it in a broad and sort of interesting class of cases. Okay, so I just want to finish with an example of an application of that theorem. So one situation we can study is just sort of the next simplest thing, which is to have 3 input points and 3 output points. In the bulk, we can realize a network that has a single vertex in the middle where everything can meet up. And then in the boundary, the kind of network you find that you have is one like this. This is a little bit complicated looking, but what you should focus on is that sort of pairs of input points, these 2 black dots, V1 and V2, can get together and meet and interact and get out to pairs of output points, but all 3 cannot meet together. Okay, there's also some complication here in that at the second level of the network, some additional quantum systems which weren't held at the input points are introduced and could potentially help you do information processing in this setting. Okay, so those are the networks we have. That's gamma, it's gamma hat. And then what this theorem tells you is that the state of the CFT that you have has some constraints on its entanglement. So maybe the most interesting one is that the mutual information between the input locations is very small. Okay, it doesn't grow with the size of the inputs, but the mutual information between one input and the other 2 is large. Okay, so V1 is entangled with V2 and V3, but not with V2 alone. Then the consequence coming from AdS CFT, if we assume this correspondence, is that you should be able to perform any information processing task in this network with entanglement that's constrained in that way. Now, that wasn't something I knew before. It's a little bit surprising. In particular, you would naively expect to need entanglement directly between the input locations, but that turns out not to be the case. And indeed, sort of directly within quantum information theory, we can verify this prediction. So we can understand now protocols that work on this network that do sort of any information processing task that this network on the left can do. Okay, that's actually not written down in our paper, and it wasn't me who figured it out, but you can ask Kafir or Florian for details there, and I won't give them now. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to say. I'll just summarize briefly. So I described this AdS-CFT duality, which is this equivalence between 2 theories, and the way that we understood it is as giving us 2 equivalent pictures for how you can do information processing tasks. Okay. I gave some examples here. We studied this network and this one. There's some other examples that are already in the literature and others that should appear soon as well. A final comment is just that, I focused here on sort of the implications from quantum gravity to quantum information theory, but this perspective, I think, is also a very direct way to link tools in quantum information theory to learn new things about quantum gravity. Somehow the connection is very simple, and you don't need to know very much AdS CFT. So it's a great place where the communities can interact. Okay, so that's everything. Thanks a lot.
Questions. There's a question all the way at the top. I should do this. Okay. No, it's okay. I thought you had the mic. I'll take the one closer first, and then.
Thanks for the nice talk. I'm wondering for the CFT entanglement you mentioned, can I think of it as entanglement in the particular state of the CFT Hilbert space? And if so, like, how do I find that state?
Oh, sorry, I missed the first part of that. Can you say again?
Oh, yeah. So for the CFT entanglement,
Yeah.
is it entanglement for a particular state of the CFT theory?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So an important aspect of this AdS CFT correspondence that I didn't describe is that the geometry in the bulk in this AdS space is recorded into the state of the CFT. And so the statement, like the property that I'm using is that, a fact about this correspondence is that whenever the bulk geometry has the property that you can meet in the middle like this, the corresponding state in the CFT will have the property that you have this entanglement between these sort of input locations. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. It's very interesting. I have a question about the actual information processing.
Yeah.
Namely, have you explored what type of coupling is necessary in order to achieve, I guess maybe my question is better stated. Is there a difference in weak and strong coupling with the AdS CFT correspondence in the processing regime?
Right. Yeah. So I think that kind of question comes up when you want to study this more detailed version that I mentioned here briefly. So here you might want to say, well, what computations do I think I can do in the bulk? And what does that tell me about this non-local computation and hence the security of position verification and so on? And, of course, we don't have a perfect understanding of AdS CFT. And so there are, statements that we believe very strongly and statements that we believe maybe less strongly, but we're pretty confident in. And depending on exactly what is true on the string theory side, you can make different arguments about what this thing is on the left. So my approach there has been to say, well, I feel like I have technical control more so on the quantum information side. So I'm going to study this object on the right. I'm going to study what kind of computations can I do with a given amount of entanglement, and then learn, potentially new things about the AdS CFT correspondence and what kind of couplings we have and so on. Yeah.
Sorry, I saw him first. I'm sorry.
Hey, thanks for a nice talk. So, okay, so as far as I understand, your statements are like, if AdS CFT is true, then this holds. So, but then can you use maybe this approach to kind of maybe disprove a few special cases or?
Yeah, potentially. So you could, we're finding implications of the AdS CFT correspondence. So if one of those implications turns out to be false, then we have some kind of issue. Either I've just made a mistake or this conjecture is false. The high energy theorists believe this conjecture very strongly. They have lots of evidence, some of which only applies to some regimes. So, there's some questions there. But, so far, this kind of program of research has increased my confidence in AdS CFT, and that we keep putting it in sort of interesting, non-trivial scenarios, and we keep getting out predictions in quantum information theory, and they keep turning out to be true. So it's kind of a cool check on AdS CFT if you want to take that perspective, or reasons to trust this as a tool to learn new things about information theory.
Thanks a lot.
All right, let's thank Alex again.